Why did the Democrats do better in the midterms than expected? We finally have someone who has the answer. So let's talk to him. Austin Ahlman works at the Intercept, and he wrote a great piece about it called "Democrats Rediscover Populism." Austin, welcome back.
Thank you. I appreciate having me on, Cenk.
No problem. So you say that there is a number of theories as to why the Democrats did better, and then you focus in on one in particular. So tell us the different theories that people in DC have for why the Democrats did better than expected in the midterm elections.
Sure. So, I mean, the first one is obviously Dobbs and the effect that that had on the electorate, right? It was a reminder of growing radicalization in the Republican Party, and that activated a lot of voters, especially in the middle, who are leery of extremes. The second one would be obviously that January 6th, the aftermath, another reminder of Republican extremism really being hammered in by a lot of candidates across the country, and especially in seats where people had actual control over election administration. So you saw that in Arizona, you saw that in Nevada, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing that I think people really are missing, and the theory that I dive into the most in my piece, is that Democrats ran, by and large, the most populist economic message that they've run in at least 20 years. And I think that you need a narrative that combines all three, especially in areas where there were not direct threats to people's liberties at the ballot box, whether, if they're in New York, abortion rights are pretty enshrined. And so if you need something to explain the successes and failures in the different states beyond just those two social issue theories. And so I talk a lot about economic populism in the piece that you mentioned, and I assume we'll dive into it a little bit now.
Yeah. So guys, every election, of course, is complicated. And so did abortion make a big difference? Yes. And it made it in specific places like Pennsylvania. And you could trace the exit polling, the results, et cetera. Did the stuff about democracy work? Actually, it did in a lot of places, especially against Secretary of States and against the most extreme Trump candidates. But it didn't work in all instances, especially when the Republican was more moderate, as Austin explains in his piece, right? But the populism piece, Austin, is the part that almost no one else is talking about, to the point where, honestly, I missed a lot of it. And I didn't see it until I read your piece. So for example, I thought one of the few predictions I got wrong, so yes, that's not getting a little bit of a humble brag there about the election, although there's not much to brag about because I thought the Democrats would do worse overall. But I thought Cortez Masto would lose in Nevada. But that's because I didn't know the populist ads that she was running. So tell us about that, because that was interesting and surprising.
Yeah, so the most viral ad of the Cortez Masto campaign, which, she's a pretty standard Democrat. She's not centrist per se, but she's a mainstream liberal Democrat. And she ran ads just absolutely obliterating her opponent, Adam Laxalt, as a lobbyist, as the son of a wealthy political family, as this and that, as rigged by wealthy donors, et cetera, et cetera. I think it was a minute-long piece, and it was just devastating. And it was the exact type of ads that a lot of us talk about wanting to see in left-wing media circles from candidates. But it didn't draw a lot of the attention from national media who were covering the race, even though it was huge on the ground. And when you look at the numbers on just like channel views, et cetera, those were the ones that got heat and got traction.
Yeah. So at the end, we'll get to whether they're actually going to do anything about any of this. But in terms of the people who ran correctly and the ones who ran incorrectly on this issue of populism, you had a couple like Katie Porter who are now in more red districts after redistricting. And she's more of a progressive, Medicare for all, attacking the corporate executives in the hearings, et cetera. And then you had people who are more open to the corporate world, being euphemistic there, the Tom Malinowski's in New Jersey, et cetera. So what happened to those two different groups? Because if you watch mainstream media, you would think, oh, Malinowski and those guys, of course, won because they were centrist Democrats, and the Porters, et cetera, lost because they were wild-eyed radical progressives. What happened in reality?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a small sample size when we're talking about incumbents that lost re-election, because most Democratic incumbents really did make it over the finish line. And you're especially talking small sample size when you're talking about Democrats that still represent Trump seats. There are only 5. But even small sample size concerns aside, really, there's no way to look at who remains in Trump won seats in the Democratic Party and who lost this election and not say that there's an economic explanation there, right? So you had, I believe, 6 Democrats that were incumbent Democrats that ran for re-election that lost. Every single member was a member of the New Democrat Caucus. So that's the corporate-friendly, by name, by virtue, centrist, mealy-mouthed sorts of Democrats. And all of them came from that caucus. Now, some of them were drawn into districts that were just, you were never going to defend them no matter how good of a candidate you are. But some of them were in perfectly winnable districts. So I specifically focus on Elaine Luria in that piece. Elaine Luria is the only Democrat in the House who's from a swing seat who served on the January 6th committee. She made it a huge part of her campaign, and she had a great foil for it. She had Elaine Kiggins, who was an election denier, a state senator with a bad history on abortion rights, et cetera. And she ran straight through with this type of candidacy. And she ran 4 points behind Biden, and she lost. It was the second biggest underperformance among this group, except for Sean Patrick Maloney, which we've all heard about. And, if you're trying to parse for an explanation of why did she do so poorly? What happened? This was such a promising campaign. It ran on the messages that everybody is saying is the winning message. Well, in reality, what she had done a few months prior to all of this work on the committee is that she had helped Democratic leadership blow up the stock trading ban. She went on, Punchbowl News's interview tour. She called it bull. She said that she was questioned the motives of people that were pushing for the ban, pushing for reforms in this area. A key, easy, low-hanging fruit populist reform. And she blasted it. And that ended up in Elaine Kiggins' ads. It ended up in debates, and really is one of the few clear explanations for her underperformance.
So when you've got the centrists not running as populists, they lost. Maybe they would have lost anyway, but they lost. When you had the Porters running on economic populism, even in relatively red to purple districts, they won. And I know every time people in Washington tell me it's a coincidence, I'm beginning to believe that it might not be a coincidence.
No, I agree with that. It's not a coincidence at all. So, Porter's seat was a tough one. She ended up running ahead of every other statewide elected Democrat. She ran ahead of Newsom, she ran ahead of Padilla, she ran ahead of just about everybody in a tough year in that area. And it wasn't just her. Even some of the people who aren't your traditional, rah, fiery populists, if they have that piece of their message and their history, they still did well. And I think a great example of this is in Ohio, Marcy Kaptur. She is the longest serving woman in House history now. With her reelection, she will have earned that title. And she has always had this populist Rust Belt streak that comes in many forms, whether it's opposing trade deals that have been really terrible for parts of the middle and working class, whether that's signaling openness to things like Medicare for all. She's always been there, even if she's not all in. That's been a piece of her messaging, and her instincts are clearly there. And it's enabled her to win quite an interesting title as longest serving woman while representing Trump territory for decades.
Yeah, and so in a sense, one of the things I was surprised by, Austin, was that they received permission to run these ads. And what I mean by that is usually what winds up happening is that they are getting their money from the donor class. And then the donor class does not like radical populism where you honestly and correctly point out the problems with the wealthy and the powerful. The wealthy and the powerful generally don't like that and don't like to fund that. So, but in this case, the Democrats were not stopped from, even like so-called centrist moderate Democrats, in reality corporate Democrats that take tons of donor money, were not stopped from running those ads, which was interesting in and of itself. What do you think happened there?
Well, so I did some reporting earlier in the cycle, and you won't hear me say nice things about the House Majority PAC and DCCC very often. But I think that this cycle, you're right to see that there was a bit of a more lax permission structure on these types of things, and even encouragement. There was poll testing of some of the messaging around like price gouging from oil companies. That came from the top. And I think part of it was just the dire straits of this cycle. A lot of the Democratic, more establishment figures, every 2 years, there's a narrative about how this is the most important election of your lifetime. And if you don't vote this time, we're going to lose everything, right? But I think this time they actually believed it, right? And so that belief in the importance of this election for the future of democracy was genuine, and it led people to realize that the polling numbers had always been the polling numbers. Progressive policies, especially populist economic progressive policies, have always been winners by any metric. Even the popularists in the party who who sometimes warn against the left flank's excesses, will admit that when it comes to basic issues like prescription drug reform, stock trading ban, things of that nature, the progressive position and saying it loudly and unapologetically is the way to go. And I think that there was finally what felt like high enough stakes for some of the people that are usually detached from some of the basic realities of these policies to get on board.
So in other words, they panicked and they're like, press the progressive button, otherwise we're going to lose. They did press the button and they wound up doing a lot better. But Austin, doesn't that mean by definition, they can press that button anytime they like and they just choose not to? That if they, and like that the people in charge of the Democratic Party even know that fact. That's why when they panicked, they pressed it. And so if they wanted to, they could run deeply populist campaigns and rout the Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is a pretty solid takeaway. I don't necessarily have that nuance of a view of how some of the establishment are responding to how their economic messaging did, but I sure hope that that's their takeaway, right? That they understand that this won for a reason. You don't see candidates like Mary Peltola, running as pro-fish, pro-choice, and frankly nothing else in Alaska, and not want to emulate that, right? Like a 1-2 winning message on social issues, abortion rights, and then 2, like I'm going to protect you from corporate fisheries that are ruining the beauty of our home state. It's quite the knockout, and I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure going forward. I would hope and I would think to give candidates that kind of space to take on corporate interests in their home state, in their home district, that are familiar to voters and that really help set them apart and give them an on the ground enemy that they're in combat with going forward. So I think that a good example of this is in Pennsylvania. Connor Lamb's old seat was actually won by another of these populist progressives. It's a dead even district, and the incoming candidate there, Christopher DeLuzio, is one of the most incredibly populist guys I've ever seen run a campaign. He had ads on television calling his opponent a corporate jagoff and saying that people like that making jobs in China are why, his neck of the woods in southwestern Pennsylvania are in the dire straits that they're in. And he won by a landslide. And he's already making waves before he's even made it into Congress. He had some fiery statements about the railroad union strike that was squashed by Congress just a few days ago, or not a few days ago, but a couple weeks back. And he was saying things to the effect of, don't ever expect me to break a strike in union territory, et cetera, already preemptively distancing himself from the party to the left on economics. And Mary Peltola from Alaska was with him on that vote. She voted against adopting the agreement and said something much the same.
So guys, when we do these interviews, if it's an article like Austin's, we'll always have the link in the description box. Make sure you check that and you read it because this article is as good as I've seen about what actually happened in these midterm elections. And if you watch or read corporate media, you'll never see the examples that were in Austin's piece. I certainly haven't seen it in anywhere in mainstream media. There's no question that populism played a huge role that was buried by corporate media. And Austin, I'll end on this, we're out of time already, but watch now. When some of these folks, if any of them are honest, it sounds like DeLuzio at least appears to be honest, and didn't run it as a gimmick, as I'm sure the Cortez Massos of the world did. If they go to actually try to do that stuff that they ran on in Congress, their number one opponent is not going to be Kevin McCarthy. It's going to be Hakeem Jeffries. I mean, because the Democratic leadership, have you seen, I'll end it on a question. Have you seen any indication that Democratic leadership, Schumer, Jeffries, Biden, would actually do a single thing that's populist? Okay, I think that we had a technical issue, but I'm not sure because the answer would be the same. Okay, no, we didn't have a technical issue. You heard the question, right? So do you think that any of these Democratic leaders would do any of these things that they ran campaigns on? I don't think so. I don't think they do one of those things.
I'm not sure. Schumer seems to be a little bit more aligned and seems to understand that you at least need to make some folks happy. Jeffries is an alarm bell for a lot of us. And I think that there were a lot of progressives that felt like they didn't really have the space to say anything about his coronation. but we'll see whether or not they should have, made some of the space of their own.
Okay, progressives in DC crack me up. They don't have the space to criticize Jeffries. Here, watch this. I just created all this space. Criticize him. Who cares? Who cares? Oh, well, they'll say he's black or something. I don't care. Why do you care? You're black. Why don't you say it? Who cares? So it's like, Jesus Christ, man. You don't have to listen to your overlords, just FYI, to any progressive in Washington, okay? Yes, Hakeem Jeffries is a corporate douche. He will never do any of those things. That's my opinion, not Austin's. Austin, thank you for the piece. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me on. Thanks, Cenk.
No problem.